Welcome back to ThinkTech, to Global Connections. We talk about Prigozhin and the aftermath of Prigozhin's folly, namely mutiny, namely insurrection, with Carl Baker, who is the Senior Advisor, Pacific Forum. Welcome to the show, Carl.
Yeah, good to be back, Jay.
Yeah, we were chatting before the show began about, it's really hard to get a handle on what's going on because it changes while you watch. And it's funny if it wasn't so tragic. So what are your thoughts going in? And it's okay if you don't get it exactly right, because nobody in the world can figure out what those guys are doing.
Yeah, well, if you go from one day to the next, it's hard to figure out. But I think, I think I'll come down here, and that is that I think that we need to appreciate the fact that Russia is run by a bunch of mafia bosses, and Putin being the chief mafia boss. And so you have guys like Prigozhin out there who basically starts doing something that looks like a mutiny, and it's really his way of sort of making demands on Putin to straighten out some of the other people in the government. And I think that's really what happened is he wasn't trying to subvert the government. He was really trying to get Putin's attention about what he saw as a problem with the Russian military not executing the war in Ukraine in a way that's positive for Russian nationalists.
I have this. I keep thinking of the Godfather, Godfather 1, and I say to myself, maybe Putin has the idea he's going to make a movie. He and Prigozhin are going to make a production company, and they'll make a fortune showing this movie all around the world. But just like the reports, from state media and all that, you can't believe any of it. So let's take it step by step. Do you believe that Prigozhin made an arm's length deal with Putin in Belarus through the great new peacemaker, Alexander Lukashenko?
Certainly, Lukashenko was involved. I have to believe that there was certainly a deal made between Prigozhin and Putin. Now, to the extent that Lukashenko was instrumental, it's a little bit hard to tell. He certainly is complicit, and certainly has sort of played the role of a mediator, moderator, participant in this whole fiasco. I mean, when you look at what he was saying yesterday, it's clear that he's fairly aware of where or what Prigozhin is up to. Not as clear that he understands what Putin's angle is on this thing.
And I would add, you had a list of adjectives for him, and one of them has to be puppet, because he is Putin's puppet. And everything you have to assume after observing him the last few years, everything he does is at Putin's instruction. Don't you think?
Well, sure, Putin is the big boss, but I mean, in some ways, Lukashenko is yet another mafia boss or sub boss in that system. I think, he's very much a lieutenant of Putin in that sense. So if by puppet you mean that, sure, he's definitely looking to Putin as the central leader. And I think that's really what's important here is that, from a purely Russian perspective, Putin has been successful, and when you look at the, if you will, misinformation that Russia is putting out about this, is they're reassuring everybody that Putin is still in control, that the key elements in the Russian government lined up behind Putin. We saw the same thing in the Shanghai Cooperation Organization meeting yesterday, where Putin played out that sort of discourse that he was in charge and that he appreciated everybody's in the SCO's support for his putting down the uprising by Prigozhin. And so I think that's the message that Russia certainly wants to get out, and that's the message that is certainly being delivered to the Russian people.
Yeah, it would seem to me that after the trauma of a week ago with the march on Moscow, Putin would be spending 24/7 trying to do damage control on his reputation, his strength, if you will, in the international community. And I would assume that pretty much everything that comes out of this is him and his efforts to do that.
Sure.
But let's go to the agreement, though. We had certain reports about the agreement, and again, misinformation, disinformation, propaganda is their middle name, all of them. So, query, what was the real agreement? Part of it was that Prigozhin would get some protection in Belarus. He could live there. He could be exiled there. That didn't last very long. And his army, those who went back and supported Putin, they would get certain benefits. They wouldn't be imprisoned. The ones who didn't go back and support Putin would be punished in some way. But I don't really have a handle on what else might have been in that agreement that they didn't tell us about. So can you connect the dots on that?
To some extent. I mean, I think the initial thrust was that you have Prigozhin demanding that Putin take action to clean up the mismanagement in the military. And in the meantime, Putin was saying, Wagner Group, you need to get out of the business and turn over your soldiers to the Russian military so that we can execute the war using your soldiers in Ukraine. And part of that is, of course, having to sign loyalty pacts with the defense ministry. And some of Prigozhin's soldiers have done that. Others haven't. They've stuck with Prigozhin, and there's still a Wagner Group that has a lot of influence in the Middle East and in sub-Saharan Africa, in Syria. So there's still a fairly big element of that Wagner Group that still exists. So I think the agreement was to downplay the role of Wagner in Ukraine and turn it over to the Russian military as their operation. But then, again, Prigozhin has said we're still actively involved in the front lines in Ukraine, suggesting that somehow there's still a Wagner identity associated with the people that have remained in Ukraine in support of the Russian military. But I think that that's really the key part of the agreement, is that there's an attempt by Putin to reduce the influence of the Wagner Group, both in Ukraine and globally.
Yeah, and look better than he was looking a week ago. Although some people say that, even to go as far as making this peace with Prigozhin is a sign of weakness. But, there have been reports, and I'm really interested in your take on this, of satellite images of large construction sites that began, right after the insurrection in Belarus.
Mm-hmm.
And we don't know what that's about, but we can speculate. Can we speculate together, Carl?
Sure. I mean, and Lukashenko has said that they are offering them locations in Belarus. So you have to assume that, in fact, there is an agreement that the Wagner Group can relocate those that want to stick with Prigozhin into Belarus.
So what's in the buildings? Is it a supply depot? Is it a troop barracks? What is it?
It's all those things. I mean, the Wagner Group, is a security company, but it also has a bunch of, other companies that are subordinate to the Wagner conglomerate that operate with mining operations in the Middle East and Africa. And so, there's military equipment that is still there. Remember, they have Wagner Group has heavy weapons, and so it's a combination of those things. I think it's the Wagner operation that's really moving to Belarus, and that seems to be what the Lukashenko agreement was that they can relocate whatever they want into Belarus, and somehow Prigozhin, it looks like, is going to continue to at least manage some of his global operation.
Well, there seems to be a clever aspect to that. Putin gets him out of Russia. He gets to be able to watch him through Lukashenko, and if Prigozhin starts up again, he'll see him at a distance. He'll see him coming from a longer way off, So Putin would have greater control somehow, no?
Well, I think that takes too much. That's too much of an American view of what's going on. That it really is a mutiny, and I think I don't think that's correct. I think that's an assumption in the Western media that has kind of played itself out, and I think that it really isn't about that. It's really about Prigozhin trying to force Putin to clean up some of the sloppy aspects of the war in Ukraine, and Putin recognizes that it's a problem. He's not going to desert his faithful defense minister and military leader in Russia, but he is going to try to clean up some of the messy aspects of the Wagner Group participation in Ukraine by forcing them to sign loyalty pacts with the Russian military.
Loyalty agreement arguably started all this up.
Mhm.
I think it had something to do with Prigozhin didn't want to sign that, and it had something to do with the money he was going to make. So far, my reading is Putin has paid Prigozhin and the Wagner Group $2 billion. And that's in addition to the gold and the diamonds they've taken out of sub-Saharan Africa. What a life, huh? He must have uku bucks there somewhere.
Well, he does. I mean, apparently, in St. Petersburg yesterday, he was showing off the gold and the treasures and his favorite Glock pistol that he picked up from his house in St. Petersburg. And and the rumors are that his airplane at least went to Moscow. Not clear where Prigozhin went, but he was clearly seen in St. Petersburg. So so again, it's way more complicated than Putin versus Wagner or Putin versus Prigozhin in a death match. Prigozhin has status in the Russian mafia or in the Russian government. Not sure those terms aren't interchangeable. But Prigozhin still has a place. He hasn't been cast out to Belarus on a permanent basis. And now the question is, what really happens with that Wagner Group operation outside of Russia? What happens in Syria? What happens because he's got bases in Syria? What happens in Africa? Is there another oligarch that comes in and tries to take over some of those operations? They're certainly high risk. And Prigozhin is well placed to continue to be able to manage those because he provides the security for operations they're somewhat precarious in their stability. Once you remove that Wagner Group security that provides support for these other people in Africa, that the countries where he's involved.
He has body doubles, Prigozhin. He has body doubles that look like him. I don't think it's too hard to look like him. He's not a pretty face. But the question is, where is he really? I don't know if the American intelligence community knows where he is really, or that he really was in Belarus to start with. There are some reports that he never actually left Russia.
Right.
And
right.
in any event, there are many reports that he's in Russia, as you say, St. Petersburg right now, counting his money. It's really extraordinary that you get so many stories that you really don't know which source and what story to believe. But I would just say, bottom line to me, seems like he's in Russia now. He had been in Belarus, but he's in Russia now, and he's got a pass from Putin. A lot of people got a pass from Putin. It's like they all made peace. And, at first there was some Russian generals that disappeared for a day or two and ostensibly being questioned about Prigozhin's claims and charges. And for a while early on, it was like Prigozhin better watch out. He's going to be assassinated because so many people in his shoes or in lesser shoes have been assassinated by Putin. His KGB bag of tricks. Watch out for that umbrella as a fellow comes down the street on you. Watch what you eat, all that radioactive food. But
Well, stay away from Windows.
stay away from. At first it seemed like Prigozhin was a dead man,
Yeah.
but that doesn't seem to be the case now. Lukashenko says no, he's free. He's okay. He's not being attacked.
There were people, I mean, if you believe the stories in the news, and it's the Western media that's saying people in St. Petersburg says, yes, we saw him. Now, maybe it was a body double, but they also reported that they saw him with his favorite Glock pistol. So so the suggestion is that he really was and maybe still is in St. Petersburg.
Yeah. One thing I wanted to ask you is the old follow the money analysis.
Mm-hmm.
There's a lot of money. I mean, most of the oligarchs don't have the money that Prigozhin has. And he's got it everywhere. If he's got these bases hither and yon, he's got the money everywhere.
Yeah.
And he's got the possibility of either spending it for or against Russia, spending it for or against Putin's interest. He's a powerful man simply by virtue of the money that he has. Mm-hmm. So the question I have is, how important does that play here? It seems to me that yes, Putin wants to recover his reputation, whatnot, but he's also driven by the money, isn't he? And this deal or these series of deals that he made with Prigozhin, it has to involve the money. Do you agree?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think that's right. I think that he recognizes that Wagner is a true force to be reckoned with. And that Russia benefits from Wagner's operations. I mean, that's why they've let him go as long as they have with what he's doing in Africa and Syria. That he has been a very effective agent for Russian wealth. I mean, his whole security operation in these places is what's allowed Russia to gain influence in the global South. So there certainly is a lot of reasons why Putin doesn't want to destroy what Prigozhin has created for Russia, and Prigozhin has made it very clear he is looking out for Russia's national interests in what he's doing. It's not that he's trying to overthrow Putin. I think that's where the American media really did get it wrong, that they saw this as a mutiny when in fact it wasn't a mutiny at all. It was a Russian way of getting attention of the big boss.
Yeah, a pretty dangerous business.
Well, but it's a dangerous business that they are engaged in.
So what's the net flow?
Yeah.
If I tell you that Putin is reputed to have paid $2 billion through the Wagner Group, that sounds legitimate in the sense that the Wagner Group has gone out and done all these things for Putin, including war in various places, really dastardly things, war crimes. At the same time, Putin has allowed Prigozhin and the Wagner Group to take resources, including valuable resources. And I guess that's the flip side of things. That's the underside of the table. That's the corrupt side that you only hear about in hushed tones. So what you have is a two-way, just my observation, you have a two-way street. You have, the Russian Federation paying the mercenaries lots of money to do their mercenary work. That's the way the contract works with mercenaries. You have to pay them. Yeah. In fact, you probably pay them more than your own army because you got to be careful with them. But the other thing is that Prigozhin must have been giving money to Putin, and whenever our oligarchs are involved, out of his booty that he's been taking out of Africa and elsewhere. Do you agree it's a two-way street? Which way is the predominant way?
It's hard to say. My guess, though, is that what Prigozhin does for the other oligarchs and for the Russian Federation is a net plus for the Russian Federation and the oligarchs, where Prigozhin certainly has his fair share, but there's a lot of benefits that you derive from a security operation that allows you to operate in a country without concern for human rights, without concern for corruption by the local government, because you have this security force that will bang a few heads if the locals get caught trying to take advantage of that Russian operation that's going on at a mine in Africa. So,
let's talk about Ukraine for a minute. There have been attacks, including very recent attacks all over, the eastern part of Ukraine, and with missiles and bombs and attacks on civilians and residences and restaurants and shopping centers. And boy, if you want to get attention, that's what you do. And apparently, Prigozhin's not there. The Wagner Group is not there. They pulled out of Ukraine, I believe. But the Russian army did not pull out of Ukraine. So my assumption would be that the Russian army is doing this, but Putin is using this opportunity to demonstrate that he's in charge, that the Russian army is capable of doing these dastardly things, and he's sailing ahead with his war crimes program. How much of that do you agree with?
I agree with that. I'll differ with you a little bit, though, on whether Wagner has left. I think, remember, shortly after the whole march to Moscow thing, Prigozhin came on the next day and said that we continue to fight in Ukraine. So even though he has left and it's not necessarily in the name of the Wagner Group anymore, he's saying his people are still there. Now, how that works out with loyalty to the Russian military and all that, I think there's still an element of the Wagner soldiers that are still involved in Ukraine. I think you're right. I think that Putin is trying to certainly make a point, but I think his point isn't so much to demonstrate that Russia maintains a capability in Ukraine, but that Russia feels that it has to demonstrate a willingness to fight harder in other areas as the Ukrainian offensive continues to work in the Donbas region, trying to break the defensive lines of the Russians. And so I think that's why you see attacks on Lviv and Kyiv and other areas, because they're trying to divert Ukrainian attention from the Donbas, where it was kind of hoped that once the Wagner Group left, that they would be able to take advantage of a Russian weakness in that area, and that's not happening from what I can see. From the reports that I've seen, Ukraine is making some progress in areas, but certainly not any dramatic changes in the last week.
Where does Rostov play in all of that? I wasn't clear on whether Prigozhin and the Wagner Group actually left Rostov. They were welcomed there by the Russian army.
The headquarters for the Ukraine operation is still there. I don't know. I mean, from what I can tell, the Wagner Group did leave. As they marched toward Moscow, they did leave, and my assumption has been that element that got 2/3 of the way to Moscow has been diverted into Belarus. Now, whether that's accurate or not, I don't know. Maybe some of them never left Rostov. I just don't know what happened. I haven't been able to see any reports that really tell us what happened there. But it certainly is out of the news, and the headquarters is still there.
So we have lots of things that are distractions these days. I mean, for example, and this is something we've heard before, the Russians have control of the nuclear plant, and they are irresponsible and nobody trusts them. And the Ukrainians said they're going to blow it up, and the Russians say, no, it's the Ukrainians. That same kind of ridiculous propaganda response. And this is reminiscent of the dam, where the Russians had control of the dam and then blew it up.
Of course, the Russians said the Ukrainians blew it up.
Sure.
The same pattern you see consistently, where each side is making the claims and then the counterclaims.
So Zaporizhia is in its own way worse than the dam. It would make Eastern Europe radioactive.
Yeah.
I mean, it's a huge threat, because we've seen what he could do with the dam, and if he lets this nuclear plant blow up, that's going to affect an enormous number of people, not only in Eastern Europe, but in a good part of Western Europe. And so that's a really meaningful threat. And it's possible that he'll do that. But it's also, to me, it's propaganda. Again, it's the nuclear threat. He trots that out whenever he wants to distract attention. And it's part of a larger plan, isn't it? To distract attention.
That's a plausible explanation. I think. I mean, I just don't know. It's there's so much disinformation on all sides, quite frankly, that it's really hard to say. What is the ground truth? How desperate is Ukraine to actually show progress in its counteroffensive? That becomes an important element also. We have to remember Ukraine has national interests that don't necessarily coincide with the American national interests here. And so they have a role to play in providing some of this information and disinformation as well. So it's hard to say. I mean, what you describe is a very anti-Russian perspective on it, and rightly so. I mean, Russia is the aggressor, but you just don't know if Ukraine is trying to provoke something here, by putting out their information to counter Russia, or if Russia really have these designs on blowing up the nuclear plant. It's just hard to tell.
It's just an information war. You're not suggesting that the Ukrainians would blow up Zaporizhia.
No, but what I'm suggesting is that they could be overstating what Russia is trying to do at Zaporizhia to make their case stronger.
One thing that was in the paper that troubled me from the American side was the fighter jets. Apparently, Joe Biden told them they would get fighter jets, and they don't have an air war going. They're getting these missiles. I don't know if they have the anti-missile capability to knock them all out of the sky, or for that matter, the artillery. Zelensky was complaining that he never got the fighter jets, and he could really use them. And, just on a gut level, I would say, what happened? Why didn't the U.S. provide what we said we were going to provide?
Well, I think I don't know the details of it, Jay, but my understanding was that, the United States was offering F-16s, but you don't just find a 20 F-16 sitting somewhere and fly them to Ukraine and say, here you go, here's the keys, son. Drive away. I mean, there's a lot of logistics that go with bringing in a fighter squadron. And
one of them is you got to train everybody.
Exactly. Yeah.
And one of the points that Zelensky made was that we were supposed to start training on June 1st. Well, it's no longer June 1st, and time is of the essence. Why haven't they started a training program for us? And that resonates with me. It's dragging heel.
Well, I don't know. I mean, like I said, I just don't. I haven't seen reports about what's happening there, and so I don't know. But again, I think you need to be very careful. With interpreting what you see in the news, because everybody has got their own angle on this thing. Now, I mean, if I had seen something from the United States explaining that, I may be able to counter what you're saying. I just haven't seen it. So I'm not aware of that particular aspect of the fighter jets. I know it's been an issue, and I also thought that it had been resolved and that it was in the works. But what you're saying is Zelensky isn't happy with the progress.
No. And so all of this that we've been talking about, which is honestly something to really watch, does it help? Is it going to exacerbate the war? Is it going to resolve the war sooner or later? What's the effect on the invasion?
You mean the Prigozhin, the whole thing with Prigozhin?
Yeah, the whole Prigozhin insurrection thing and all the impossible propaganda that followed and that is following. How does that affect, if a Ukrainian asked you, Carl, how is this going to affect the war? Am I better off now or worse?
And I think the answer is you're the same. I think ultimately this is in the context of the Ukrainian war, it's a tempest in the teapot. That really it's not going to change the dynamic of the war, because the war is basically a stalemate at this point. You're now in trench warfare in eastern Ukraine. And I think that's where the war is going to stay. There's minor. I mean, not minor if you're under the attack of missiles from Russia, but you're going to have minor incursions into Lviv, into Kyiv and things like that. But the fact is that the war is stalemated in the Donbass and to some extent southern Ukraine. But so this whole thing with Prigozhin isn't going to change. The Wagner Group did what it did in Ukraine. It certainly took a lot of losses in Bakhmut. It certainly was a part of the reason why it was so hard for the Ukrainians to hold Bakhmut. That's done. I mean, in some ways, that was the Wagner mission in Ukraine. As far as Russian military is concerned, that's done. It's over. Now we're going to move on to the next phase of stalemated war in eastern Donbass.
You mentioned, and certainly the press has mentioned, that Prigozhin's criticism of the generals and the Ministry of Defense, there's a euphemism, was serious. And at first, Putin really didn't buy it, but later it seemed that he did. And presumably, he's going to take steps to improve what Prigozhin was complaining about. Do you think that will happen? I mean, we have trench warfare. We have the Russian military, which is really stuck in its own cultural juices. Very hard to change things in the Russian military. Do you think that things will change in the Russian military?
No, I don't. I mean, I think that it is a sort of an ossified system in Russia. I mean, and that really, I mean, I think the real lesson I think to learn from this is that Russia is a very brittle autocratic system. The government is very autocratic. If you look at what we can learn in Russia, is that it is a very decrepit system that is ultimately broken. I mean, and that's the real lesson I think we learn from this, is that yes, Putin is going to survive, but the Russian state is in a horrible condition. And I think that's the lesson that everybody is learning from this, both and especially the Chinese. I mean, from the Chinese side, the Chinese say, see, this is what happens when you don't rely on the party as the central mechanism for governance. Because Russia has let the party fall by the wayside. And so I think that's China's lesson. I think from the global South, the lesson is we can rely on Russia, but they're really not a good partner because they have all this corruption, they have all these mercenaries and all these mafia bosses, that oligarchs that come out and sort of take advantage of us and then leave. So it's going to push, I think, the global South more towards China in terms of somebody that they look at with respect or with the hopes of being able to find an alternate to the Western global system.
Yeah, he certainly has lost face in a number of places, including China and other places.
You say he, but I say Russia has lost face.
Okay.
As far as Putin is concerned, he's done what Putin has always done. Is he's demonstrated that he has the ability to ultimately control the oligarchs. But the entity that has lost face is the Russian state.
He's trying to patch it up, though. He's doing diplomacy hither and yon. He's trying to reestablish his relations.
Yeah, and I mean, and all this posturing about how thank you everybody for showing support for the Russian state, and look at how resilient we were in the face of a Prigozhin who was defecting from the state and all that. So sure, that's all part of Putin's cover up campaign, or not cover up campaign, but recovery campaign.
Yeah, there are a lot of things I was going to ask you whether they were connected with that campaign, but I think these days you always have to ask that question: is this move or that move connected with his campaign to recover, face and all that. So last question, Carl. Ready?
Mm-hmm. Boy, Jay's last questions are always difficult. So with some trepidation.
Could this happen again?
Oh, sure. It could, and I'm sure that there's several right-wing people out there, especially Dugin, who has probably learned something from this whole charade, if you will, or this whole excursion by Prigozhin. I'm sure that, but it's from the ultra right. I mean, that's the thing we need to appreciate. You know, the Americans the West was sort of excited about this, thinking, oh, this could be a revolution that finally topples Putin. But careful what you. There was an article that somebody put out. Careful what you wish for, because the alternative is not Navalny. It's somebody even further right, the ultra right in Russia. And so if you think Putin, sort of the grand manipulator is bad news, then you get these guys like Dugin who are sitting out there in the wings. So could it happen again? Oh, I think it could. And I think we need to be a little bit careful in preparing for that. And I think that's what China sees. China is saying, yeah, we support Putin, and we think Putin is doing a great job. But I think they very nervously look at the alternatives to Putin, just like we do, just like we should.
Yeah, boy, the world is. We had a show just a couple hours ago about La Belle France.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
And it's the right wing that like to see the police be stronger and crush any protest and all that. And at the same time, you really wonder. And Macron is saying, well, this is all social media. He wants to shut social media down, and maybe with good cause. But when you say social media, you say the provocations that can be organized on social media, you have to think of Prigozhin. That's what he was doing. He was running the Internet Research Agency. He was putting out disinformation in every market that he could possibly. He was involved in the 2016 election in this country. So query, what, if anything, is the connection between the riots in France and the disruption to the EU? This is also in Switzerland, the French-speaking Switzerland, and the affair and the status in Russia.
There is a populist right-wing movement afoot in the world, and it's right here in your favorite United States of America. As you know, to really eliminate big government, and it's a pretty scary prospect when you look at it across the world of what's happening, and I think when you do that, I think that's when you begin to recognize that China just continues to be more and more attractive in the global South, because it emphasizes stability, it emphasizes non-involvement in internal affairs, and all these things. And you look at the democracies, and they're struggling with this social media. They're struggling with controlling information, in an effective way, in providing information. There's questioning of the big media as being biased and doing its own form of misinformation. So I think it's a pretty scary prospect, and I think the common element is a real loss of faith around the world in institutions associated with democracy and human rights.
Oh God! Thank you, Carl. Carl Baker, Senior Advisor to Pacific Forum. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for watching ThinkTech Hawaii. If you like what we do, Please click on the like and subscribe buttons on youtube.com/ThinkTech Hawaii. You can also follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and LinkedIn. And check out our website, thinktechhawaii.com. Mahalo.